Lights were off on floors that used to stay bright late into the night. I remembered staying late, fixing things no one knew about, believing it mattered. The company didn't fall because people stopped working hard. They worked harder than ever. It fell because effort was used to hide problems instead of facing them. The decision to fire me had been made to save money. What it really did was remove the one role that slowed failure down. Once that was gone, everything else followed naturally. Months later, the company's name stopped appearing anywhere. No updates, no posts, no job listings. Just a quiet end. A short note online mentioned a failed startup and tough conditions. That was all. I kept my notes, but I never shared them. I didn't need to. The outcome said enough. Every warning that had been ignored showed up in the final result. Every shortcut became a cost. Looking back, I don't feel angry. I feel clear. I didn't ruin anything. I didn't take revenge. I simply stopped protecting a system I was no longer trusted to guard. The truth did the rest. The company believed cutting my role was smart. It looked that way on a spreadsheet. One less salary. One less line. What they didn't see was the work that never appeared on paper. The problems that never reached customers. The failures that never became incidents. When that protection was removed, the system behaved honestly. And honesty was not kind. I moved on to a place where questions are welcomed and prevention is valued. Where silence is not mistaken for success. The startup didn't fail because I was fired. It failed because leadership believed unseen work was optional. When they cut it to save money, they also cut the future. That single decision didn't hurt right away. But it decided everything that came after. People found out in waves. Some were told their roles would end soon. Others were asked to stay and help win things down. Everyone reacted differently. Shock. Relief. Anger. Mostly exhaustion. I was asked to join one last call with leadership and investors. They wanted me to explain, in plain terms, what had gone wrong. I did. I spoke slowly. I avoided blame. I explained how prevention works. How silence can look like success. How cutting protection doesn't break things right away, but guarantees they will break later. No one interrupted me. When the call ended, there was nothing left to discuss. The decision had already been made. That night, I thought about the moment I was fired. How small it had seemed. How careful the words were. No one had raised their voice. No one had panicked. Now I could see the full shape of it. The restructure hadn't just removed a cost. It had removed understanding. And once understanding is gone, no amount of effort can replace it. The company was finished. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. The shutdown didn't come with a single announcement. It came in pieces. One team was let go, then another. Projects were paused, then quietly canceled. Tools stopped being renewed. Offices closed early on Fridays. The company was shrinking without saying the word. Customers noticed first. Messages went unanswered. Features stopped improving. Support replies became short and careful. Some customers left politely. Others didn't say anything at all. Silence followed them. Leadership stopped holding meetings for the future. Every discussion was about the present. How to finish obligations. How to avoid legal trouble. How to explain things without admitting too much. The energy that once filled the company was gone. I was no longer involved, but I heard updates through former coworkers. They sounded tired. Not angry. Just worn down. People don't fight hard for something once they know it's over. One evening, I walked past the old office building. The single decision to fire me had seemed small. Now it was clear it had changed everything. The audit report finally arrived. Not as a presentation, not as a meeting, but as a document shared quietly with leadership. Word spread fast anyway. People could tell by the way leaders walked through the office, slow and careful, like they were carrying something heavy. The report didn't blame the market. It didn't mention bad timing or unlucky breaks. It focused on decisions. Specific ones. Dates. Names. Actions taken and protections removed. The timeline was clear and uncomfortable. One section stood out to everyone who read it. It explained how a single role had handled prevention across multiple systems. How that role had been removed during the restructure. How failures began shortly after. Not immediately, but predictably. Leadership stopped arguing after that. Meetings were called with investors. Long ones. Quiet ones. No optimism. Just facts. The question was no longer how to grow. It was whether survival was still possible. Inside the company, people spoke in low voices. No one joked. No one rushed. Everyone understood something had ended, even if no one said it out loud. I felt a strange calm reading the report. Not satisfaction. Just confirmation. Everything I had warned about had happened. Not because I wanted it to, but because it was allowed to. The company had tried to save money by cutting unseen work. The report made the cost visible. And once the cost was clear, there was no way to hide from it. The response came quickly after that. Investors pulled back funding plans. Not all at once, but enough to matter. Future money disappeared from forecasts. Leadership stopped using the word recovery. A closed meeting was held for managers. The message was direct. Prepare for downsizing. Sell what could be sold. Protect what little remained. The dream was over. I was asked to provide written explanations of my past work. I did, clearly and simply. I explained what I handled, why it mattered, and what happened when it was removed. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't add emotion. I let the facts stand on their own. When I finished, the auditor thanked me. It was the first time in months anyone had done that. That night, I realized something important. Even if the company survived, it would never be the same. Trust had been broken at every level. With customers. With investors. With employees. The restructure was meant to save the company. Instead, it had stripped away the very thing that kept it safe. And now everyone could see it clearly. The audit report wasn't shared right away, but its impact was felt immediately. Leadership stopped pushing back on bad news. They stopped correcting the narrative. Meetings focused on damage control, not growth. Investors grew distant. Calls were shorter. Questions were sharper. Funding discussions quietly disappeared. The future that once felt close was suddenly out of reach. An internal meeting was held to discuss next steps. No big speeches. No motivation. Just options. None of them were good. Cut more costs. Sell parts of the business. Wind things down slowly. People listened without reacting. When hope fades, even bad news feels expected. I was asked one last time if I would consider returning to help stabilize things. This time, they offered access and authority. I listened carefully, then declined. Not because I wanted to see the company fail, but because it was too late to undo the damage. Stability can't be rushed. It has to be built over time. The company had chosen shortcuts instead. As days passed, layoffs began quietly. One team at a time. No announcements. Just empty desks. People said goodbye in private messages. The company wasn't collapsing in a dramatic way. It was shrinking. And shrinking is harder to stop than falling. I was contacted by someone involved in the review. They asked about my former role. What I handled. What protections existed before the restructure. I answered honestly. Calmly. Without emotion. As the days passed, the tone inside the company shifted again. Meetings grew quiet. Leadership spoke less. Confidence didn't return. It drained away. The auditors noticed patterns. Safeguards removed during cost cuts. Problems increasing afterward. Customer losses following the same path. The timeline was clear. My former coworkers told me leadership was finally asking the right questions. Too late, but right. What had been removed? Why had no one tracked the risk? The answers were uncomfortable. One afternoon, I received a message asking if I would be willing to explain the system to the auditors directly. I agreed. Not to help the company recover, but to make the truth clear. During that session, no one interrupted me. No one argued. The facts spoke for themselves. For the first time, the failure had a shape. And that shape pointed back to one decision made to save money without understanding its cost. After the audit meetings, everything slowed. Decisions were paused. Emails were rewritten again and again before being sent. Leadership stopped making promises because no one knew what could actually be delivered. The auditors asked follow-up questions. Hard ones. Why were certain protections removed without backups? Why were warnings not documented? Why did customer losses match internal risk points so closely? Each question cut deeper. Leadership tried to explain the restructure as necessary. Money had been tight. Survival required sacrifice. The auditors didn't argue. They just asked why the sacrifice had focused on prevention instead of expansion or marketing. No one had a good answer. Inside the company, fear settled in. People knew layoffs were coming. Not because of rumors, but because of silence. When leaders stop talking, it's never a good sign. Once investors doubt leadership, recovery becomes almost impossible. The weeks that followed felt heavy. Nothing moved unless it had to. Every request needed approval. Every approval took time. The speed the company once bragged about was gone. In its place was fear of making the wrong move. Customers kept leaving, slowly but steadily. Not in waves. In quiet decisions. One by one. Each loss was explained away as timing or fit, but the pattern was impossible to ignore. The business was shrinking in real time. Leadership tried to regain control by tracking everything. New dashboards. New reports. More meetings. Numbers were reviewed daily, sometimes hourly. But tracking damage is not the same as stopping it. By the time something showed up on a chart, it was already too late. Support teams were burned out. They apologized more than they solved. Engineers avoided risky changes, even when risk was unavoidable. Everyone was protecting themselves now. I heard leadership was debating whether to admit mistakes publicly. The idea was dropped. It would scare investors. It would look weak. So they stayed quiet. That silence spread. An internal message announced temporary measures to stabilize the company. Fewer services. Reduced expectations. Customers noticed immediately. Confidence dropped again. The company had become careful in all the wrong ways. It avoided truth instead of risk. And without truth, there was no clear path forward. The decision to fire me had saved money for a moment. Now the company was spending time, trust, and energy just to stay standing. And even that was no longer guaranteed. The audit was announced without warning. A short message. Outside reviewers. Full access. Leadership called it routine. No one believed that. The auditors asked for timelines, change histories, and risk plans. Teams scrambled. Files were missing. Decisions had never been written down. Explanations didn't line up. The deeper they looked, the worse it became. The money saved by firing me disappeared in weeks. Still, no one admitted the original mistake out loud. I watched from a distance, feeling detached. This was no longer about me. It was about a company chasing control it had already lost. A former coworker told me people were afraid to deploy changes now. Fear had replaced speed. That fear spread into everything. The system had reached a point where effort could no longer compensate for missing structure. You can't rush stability. You either build it early or pay for it later. The company had chosen later. The real panic began when an investor joined an emergency call. Their tone was calm, but their questions were sharp. Why were customers leaving? Why were fixes failing? Why did costs keep rising after the restructure? Leadership answered with rehearsed confidence. The investor listened, then asked for documentation. Not promises. Proof. That proof didn't exist. Safeguards had been removed without records. Decisions were made verbally. Risk had never been tracked. The story leadership told didn't match the data. The call ended quickly. Later that day, spending was frozen. Hiring stopped. Marketing paused. The company shifted from growth mode to survival mode in hours. An internal message went out asking teams to prepare for possible changes. No details. Just uncertainty. People stopped working late. Not because things were fixed, but because hope was gone. You can't push yourself forever when the ground keeps moving. I received one more message asking if I would help explain things to the investor. I asked if they wanted honesty or comfort. There was no reply. That silence said everything. The decision to fire me had been framed as smart cost control. Now investors were questioning every decision leadership had made since. Trust was draining upward, the same way customers had drained downward. The company wasn't collapsing yet, but it had crossed a line. Behind the words, fear spread. People updated resumes quietly. Conversations moved to private chats. Trust inside the company faded the same way it had with customers. Support tickets piled up faster than ever. Engineers worked nights trying to trace problems through systems they didn't fully understand. Every fix felt like guessing in the dark. I received one final message asking if I would help temporarily, just to stabilize things. This time, it came with urgency. I asked again about authority and access. The reply avoided the question. I said no. Not because I wanted the company to fail, but because saving it halfway would only stretch the pain. The decision to fire me had already done its damage. Protection cannot be added back after trust is gone. That night, I realized something clearly. The company didn't fail because money was tight. It failed because leadership believed cutting unseen work had no consequences. Now, every consequence was arriving at once. After the contract ended, leadership stopped pretending the problem was temporary. Meetings became urgent and closed-door. Decisions were made quickly, often reversed the next day. Nothing felt steady anymore. Support teams were overwhelmed. Tickets stayed open for days. Customers followed up again and again. Some stopped waiting and moved on. The company's name began appearing in quiet warnings between customers, not public complaints, but careful advice to be cautious. Engineers tried to rebuild parts of the system from memory. Pieces that had once worked together now clashed. Fixes caused new failures. Every solution created another unknown. Leadership hired another consultant, then another. Each brought a different idea. None had context. None understood why certain choices had been made in the past. Time was spent explaining symptoms instead of solving causes. Costs rose quickly. Consultant fees. Emergency tools. Refunds. By the next month, the company felt smaller, even from the outside. Fewer updates. Fewer posts. Silence where excitement used to be. Leadership stopped talking about growth and started talking about stability, but the word felt hollow now. Inside, pressure crushed what was left of morale. People worked longer hours, but nothing improved. Every fix felt rushed. Every decision felt late. The system no longer bent when pushed. It cracked. Finance meetings grew frequent. Cash flow was reviewed daily. Costs were cut again, this time without warning. Travel stopped. Tools were downgraded. Small comforts disappeared. The company was shrinking inward. Another former coworker reached out. They sounded tired. They said everyone was afraid to touch the wrong thing because no one knew what the wrong thing was anymore. I understood that fear well. It was the fear I used to absorb quietly so others never had to feel it. Leadership finally admitted something wasn't right. They didn't say why. Just that things were harder than expected. They promised a turnaround plan. The plan didn't include rebuilding what had been removed. It focused on pushing harder with fewer people. That was the moment I knew the outcome was locked. When leaders double down instead of looking back, failure stops being a possibility and becomes a path. The company hadn't just lost protection. It had lost humility. And without humility, there was no way to recover what had already been broken. The next loss hit harder. A long-term customer ended their contract completely. No pause this time. No warning call. Just a formal notice and silence after. Revenue dropped in a way that could not be explained away. Leadership held an all-hands meeting. The tone was serious, almost pleading. They talked about unity and commitment. They said everyone needed to step up. No one asked questions. No one clapped. A former coworker told me the consultant asked basic questions I had answered months ago. Leadership seemed relieved. Someone was doing something. I felt no anger. Only distance. The company believed it could replace understanding with effort. But effort without direction only burns people out faster. That night, I reviewed my old notes again. Every warning. Every decision. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't a sudden failure. It was a slow one, built piece by piece, starting the moment leadership decided protection was optional. The consultant's fixes worked for a short time, just long enough to calm leadership. A few dashboards turned green again. Messages went out about progress. Hope returned, thin but visible. Then the issues came back. Not in the same way. In new places. deeper places. The system reacted badly to the changes meant to save it. Delays grew longer. Errors became harder to trace. Support teams couldn't explain what was happening. Engineers chased problems without knowing where they started. Meetings stretched late into the night. No one slept well. Another customer paused their account. This one mattered more. Revenue dipped enough to trigger alarms in finance. Leadership stopped pretending. They asked hard questions now. Why was everything so fragile? Why did fixes keep failing? Why didn't anyone understand the system fully? The answer was right in front of them, but no one wanted to say it out loud. I received another message asking if I would consider helping short-term. This time, they mentioned money. Still no authority. Still no access. I declined again. Not because I wanted revenge, but because stepping in would only delay the truth one more time. And delaying truth was what had caused all of this. The company had cut my role to save money. Now it was spending far more trying to survive without it. And the cost was no longer just financial. It was structural, emotional, and permanent. Soon after, that customer paused their account. Not canceled. Paused. Leadership said it was temporary. I saw it as a warning. Finance teams updated forecasts quietly. Meetings about cost returned, but now the tone was different. It wasn't about efficiency anymore. It was about survival. Someone from leadership reached out to me again. This time, more direct. They asked if I could help review things, just informally. I asked what authority I would have. The answer was still vague. I declined again. That night, I thought about how small the original decision had seemed. One role cut. One line item removed. Now the company was spending energy, trust, and time trying to replace something it never fully understood. The restructure didn't cause the problem. It revealed it. After the pause, leadership stopped using confident language. Messages became careful and short. Updates focused on effort instead of results. Teams were thanked for working hard, even when progress was unclear. Inside the company, fixes were stacked on top of fixes. No one fully understood how changes connected anymore. One problem would be solved, and two more would appear somewhere else. The system felt tight, like it was being stretched too far. Support teams were told to respond faster. Short answers replaced clear ones. Customers noticed. Some stopped asking questions and started preparing backups. That silence was dangerous. I heard leadership was debating whether firing me had been a mistake. The conversation didn't last long. Bringing me back would cost money and admit error. Neither option felt acceptable to them. Instead, they hired a cheaper consultant. Someone new. Someone without history. I knew what would happen. Without context, they would treat symptoms, not causes. They would make the system louder, not safer. Inside the company, meetings became tense. People spoke carefully. Every decision felt rushed. Leadership talked about staying calm, but their actions showed worry. New rules were added. New checks were rushed in. None of them addressed the real problem. The team tried to rebuild safeguards without fully understanding why they existed in the first place. It was like copying a lock without knowing what it protected. Some fixes worked for a day. Others made things worse. I followed updates quietly. I didn't reach out. I didn't offer help. I had already been clear about what was needed, and that had been ignored. Stepping back in now would only hide the damage again. One evening, I saw a post from a customer asking if the company was still reliable. The question stayed unanswered for hours. That silence spoke louder than any response. Leadership released another statement saying improvements were underway. The words felt forced. Confidence without proof. I understood then that the company wasn't just dealing with technical problems. It was dealing with doubt. And doubt spreads faster than failure. The restructure had saved money on paper. But the cost was showing up everywhere else. And the bill was still growing. The breaking point didn't arrive as a crash. It arrived as exhaustion. Teams were tired. Support staff were overwhelmed. Engineers patched issues without knowing what might fail next. Everyone was reacting instead of planning. A major customer raised concerns in a private call. Not angry, just careful. They asked if the company could still handle growth. Leadership promised improvements. Timelines were shared. Confidence was forced. Behind the scenes, nothing changed. I heard the customer asked for proof, not promises. Proof that the systems were stable. The company didn't have it. Logs were messy. Safeguards were missing. Explanations were unclear. The company wasn't broken yet, but it was exposed. And when systems are exposed under pressure, they don't fail loudly at first. They leak. They confuse. They wear people down. That kind of damage is slow, but it spreads everywhere. The first real loss came quietly. A customer didn't renew. No announcement. No warning. Just a gap where revenue used to be. Leadership said it was unrelated. A timing issue. The market. But I knew better. The customer had complained weeks earlier. About delays. About trust. About not feeling heard. Those were the same signals I used to treat as urgent. More customers followed. Not many. Just enough to be noticed by finance. Questions started to appear in meetings. Why were numbers slipping after the restructure? Why did support look overwhelmed? Inside the company, stress replaced confidence. People worked longer hours. More patches were pushed. Fixes were rushed without understanding. Each solution solved one thing and broke another. I heard leadership was considering hiring again. Then the idea was dropped. It cost too much. They believed the problems could still be managed internally. A former coworker sent me a message asking if I would consider coming back as a contractor. Just to help for a bit. No promise of access. No authority. Just support. I declined politely. Not out of spite, but clarity. The problem wasn't missing effort. It was missing structure. And structure can't be rebuilt halfway. That night, another customer posted publicly about issues. This time, others agreed openly. The silence was gone. The company had saved money by firing me. Now it was spending trust. And trust, once lost, is far more expensive to replace. By the fourth week, leadership could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. Numbers were still decent, but the trend was clear. Growth had slowed. Support costs had increased. Complaints were no longer isolated. They formed a pattern. I answered carefully. I explained what I could without stepping back in. They said leadership wanted quick fixes. I said quick fixes would make it worse. That message was never answered. Later that week, I saw a post from a customer asking if anyone else was having issues. More replies followed. Quiet agreement. No panic yet, but concern. I realized then that firing me hadn't saved money. It had only delayed cost. Every problem they skipped early would return later, heavier and harder to lift. The company was learning something I already knew. You can't cut protection and expect stability. You can only postpone the moment when weakness becomes visible. By the third week, the problems were no longer quiet. A few customers reported missing data. Others said features worked one day and failed the next. Support replies became slower and less clear. The company still called it temporary. Growing pains. Adjustment period. I could see the pattern clearly. The issues all came from the same weak points I used to guard. Without those checks, small mistakes slipped through and stacked on top of each other. Each one alone looked manageable. Together, they were dangerous. Leadership shared another update online, saying the company was stronger after the restructure. I read it twice. The words didn't match what customers were seeing. Confidence was being used as a shield. A former coworker called me that night. Not to ask for help directly, but to vent. They said things felt unstable. That people were guessing instead of knowing. I listened quietly. When they asked what I thought, I told the truth. The system needed protection it no longer had. They sighed and said leadership wanted speed, not explanations. After the call, I sat in silence for a while. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel guilty either. I had been removed. I had warned them. I had done my job. Then I noticed a small complaint. A customer mentioned delays they hadn't seen before. Another asked why support answers felt different. Nothing serious. Just questions. The kind I used to handle before they spread. Inside the company, I knew these signs would be ignored. Small issues were easy to dismiss. Leadership would call them normal bumps after a restructure. I could almost hear the words. A few days later, I received a message from a former coworker. They asked if I knew why a certain process felt harder now. I explained carefully, without blame. They thanked me and said they would pass it on. Nothing changed. That was when it became clear. The company wasn't failing yet. It was drifting. Without someone watching the small details, problems weren't being stopped. They were being delayed, reshaped, and pushed forward. I closed my laptop and went on with my day. I had done my part. From here on, the system would behave exactly as it was built. And that meant the truth would come out slowly, one issue at a time. By the second week, the tone shifted. Support response times grew longer. Customers followed up on tickets that hadn't been answered. Small errors turned into repeated ones. Patterns were forming, even if no one wanted to name them yet. Inside the company, pressure increased. Remaining staff were asked to do more with less. Roles blurred. People filled gaps they didn't fully understand. Effort went up. Clarity went down. Leadership shared another message about staying focused and moving fast. They said the restructure was already paying off. Costs were lower. Morale was strong. The message felt thin. A former teammate reached out again. This time, they were worried. They said a system behaved strangely under load. I knew exactly why. I also knew fixing it would require time, access, and planning, none of which the company had chosen to keep. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes. I was told the company was restructuring to save money. My role, they said, was being removed. It wasn't personal. It was necessary. They thanked me for my work and said this decision would help the company survive. I listened quietly. I asked one question. Who would handle the responsibilities I managed? The answer was vague. Tasks would be shared. Systems would be simplified. Everything would be fine. I nodded and signed the papers. There was no anger yet, just shock. I handed over my access that same day. I was given a short list of tasks to document. Only the visible ones. No one asked about the hidden work. On my last afternoon, I walked through the office slowly. People avoided eye contact. Some said they were sorry. Others said nothing at all. Leadership had already moved on. As I left, I felt a strange calm. Not relief. Not rage. Just clarity. The company believed it had saved money. It believed cutting my role was smart and safe. What they didn't understand was what they had actually removed. Not a person. A layer of protection. At home that night, I opened a notebook and wrote down everything I remembered. Not to prove anything. Just to keep the truth clear. If things went wrong later, I wanted to remember this moment. The moment the company chose silence over safety. The first week after I left, nothing happened. At least, nothing anyone talked about. The company posted updates online about staying strong and moving forward. Leadership looked confident. Cutting costs had worked, they said. The charts looked fine. I watched from a distance. Old habits are hard to break. I checked public updates and customer forums out of curiosity. Everything seemed calm. That didn't surprise me. Most of my work had never shown results right away. It delayed problems. It didn't erase them. That was when I realized something had changed. Leadership wasn't interested in prevention. They cared about response. Fixing visible problems looked productive. Quietly stopping problems before they happened didn't show on any chart. I went back to my desk and finished my work for the day. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I wasn't there to catch things early. The thought stayed with me longer than I liked. The talk about cutting costs grew louder. Meetings started earlier and lasted longer. Leadership shared slides about efficiency and survival. They said tough choices were coming, but the company would be stronger after. I listened carefully, trying to hear what wasn't being said. My work didn't appear on any slide. There were charts for sales, growth, and hiring. There was nothing about risk, prevention, or stability. I realized then how easy it would be to remove something that didn't show up on paper. I tried again to explain my role. I sent a message asking for time to walk through the systems I protected. The reply came hours later. Let's circle back. We never did. Soon after, leadership asked everyone to document their responsibilities. I wrote carefully, but the hardest parts of my job didn't fit cleanly into words. How do you explain problems that never happened? How do you prove value when success looks like silence? As weeks passed, decisions were made faster. Safeguards were delayed. Shortcuts were praised. I fixed what I could, but I felt the ground shifting under me. One evening, as I packed up to leave, I saw a calendar invite on my screen for a private meeting the next day. No details. Just a title that said Organizational Update. I stared at it for a long moment. I already knew what it meant. And for the first time since joining the company, I felt something break, not in the system, but in my trust. Fewer people. Less cost. Faster results. I understood the need to be careful, but I also saw what they didn't. Cutting the wrong thing could be dangerous. During one meeting, someone asked why operations seemed so stable compared to other startups. Leadership smiled and said the team was strong. That answer was accepted. No one asked how that stability was maintained. No one looked deeper. I noticed my role was still unclear to most people. Some thought I was support. Others thought I was technical help. No one really knew what I owned. That worried me. When a role is unclear, it's easy to misunderstand its value. I thought about explaining my work more clearly. I almost asked for time to walk leadership through the risks I manage every day. But things were moving fast, and everyone seemed busy. I told myself there would be time later. I didn't know that later was already slipping away. The first sign came in a quiet conversation. I overheard two managers talking about cost savings. They were listing roles they believed could be combined or removed. My role was mentioned briefly. One of them said it sounded supportive, not critical. The other agreed. I felt a tight knot in my chest, but I stayed calm. I told myself they didn't have the full picture. Surely, once they reviewed my work, they would understand. I decided to prepare. I gathered notes about issues I had prevented, outages that never happened, problems customers never saw. It wasn't dramatic, but it was important. When I finally got a chance to speak, the conversation moved quickly. Leadership listened, nodded, and thanked me. Then they moved on to the next topic. No questions. No follow-up. A week later, a small issue reached customers. Nothing serious, but it caused confusion. Support struggled. I fixed it within an hour. Leadership praised the team for responding quickly. Again, no one asked how the issue could have been prevented. I joined the startup because they said they needed someone reliable. Not flashy. Not loud. Just someone who could keep things from breaking while the company grew fast. My job description was short and vague, which should have been a warning. I was told to support operations and handle issues as they came up. At the time, that sounded flexible. I later learned it meant invisible. From the start, I noticed how fragile everything was. Systems worked because people remembered steps, not because they were built well. When something went wrong, it wasn't tracked. It was just fixed and forgotten. I became the person who fixed things before anyone else noticed. Small errors. Missed updates. Quiet gaps that could turn into real problems if left alone. I stayed late often. Not because I was asked to, but because I knew what would happen if I didn't. When issues were solved early, no one panicked. Leadership saw smooth charts and steady numbers. They believed the company was stable. No one knew how close things came to failing most weeks. And no one knew that stability wasn't luck. It was effort. I didn't mind the silence at first. I thought that was the deal. Do good work. Stay out of the spotlight. Help the company grow. What I didn't realize was that when work stays invisible for too long, people stop believing it matters. And once leadership decides something doesn't matter, it becomes very easy to cut it. As the company grew, my workload grew with it. New customers came in faster than systems could adjust. Each new feature added pressure to parts of the product that were already weak. When something almost failed, I fixed it quietly. When something broke slightly, I fixed it completely. I didn't file long reports. I didn't ask for meetings. I just made sure things worked. Leadership started talking more about money. Burn rate. Runway. Efficiency. I heard the word lean almost every day. It was always said with pride.